Everyone had a nice lunch. We're going to dive into a conversation about budget adjustment. That we're probably going to have two more conversations about before we totally wrap up. I'm sure everyone knows we usually don't play a very large role in budget adjustment. And I think what we're going to tackle this year is language cleanup that we're going to need to be putting in, as well as a few Ed Fund updates. So with that, I think we're going to hear from the administration. Are you two, do you have separate road shows or coming up together?
We're tag teaming, as we always do. We're very close.
Okay, here's an extra chair. Yeah, we're going to get another chair. Hold on, wait.
Thanks.
Is Rep. Brannigan in the building?
Yeah, she is.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, we didn't notice the absence of chair before this moment.
That's okay. Happened.
How we doing?
Ready to roll?
There you go.
January is good.
I think for these presentations, we are not going to share screens. We're all just going to look at our own devices. Can everyone manage that?
Sure can.
Great.
So is that now committee protocol?
That's our committee. When we started, we were looking at our own screens. But it felt nice to have, if it's on the big screen, then we're more likely to look at you instead of just like, you have no idea what I'm doing here, but I might not be paying any attention to you at all. But if I'm looking at the screen, you can think I'm paying attention. So
Well, I hope
it's a sense
to
of-
hold your attention with the passion in my presentation.
That's what we want everyone.
Budget adjustment is really tough for passion, though, I have to admit.
Should I pull this up?
No, we're just going to follow along at home. Thank you.
Oh, you can.
Yeah, you can use your computer, however you see fit, Saoirse. Floor is yours.
Thank you. So Adam Gresham, Commissioner of Finance and Management.
Craig Bolio, Tax Commissioner.
So, Madam Chair, what I thought I would do is give you guys a big picture view of how we constructed the budget adjustment and dive into what I think. And I provided a sheet that is specific to Ways and Means. That is my judgment. That's not, I mean, you may get from the House Appropriations or other material, but I think I covered it. So the budget adjustment this year was somewhat hearkening back to the old days when budget adjustments were snoozers. I mean, they were supposed to be more an accountant's dream than a policymaker's dream. And, over the past 2 or 3 years, we had more policy than typical in budget adjustment because we had more money than typical. We had a lot of one-time money. We had a lot of revenue over forecast. And so we often, trying to get that money on the ground out in communities, would come to budget adjustment with that. This year, much less so. So what did we have available to invest? Well, back in July, the Emergency Board upgraded the fiscal 24 revenue forecast by a little over $78 million. So that's $78 million that we did not know about when the fiscal 24 budget was locked in. So that immediately became available in budget adjustment. We had a number of smaller, what we're calling direct applications, transfers from funds that were higher than we anticipated. The Attorney General was a little bit more profitable in the settlement fund than they anticipated. Unclaimed property, the gift that keeps on giving, and sports wagering. And sports wagering is you'll see it later on in the language. So when sports wagering crossed the finish line, the Joint Fiscal Office made an estimate of revenue from sports wagering, which seemed reasonable. More recent information from the vendors that we will be working with to initiate sports wagering, we were able to give more updated information, which resulted in about, I think, $2 million extra to the bottom line. So we're recognizing that in the budget adjustment. The bigger picture, in addition to the revenue upgrade of $78 million, were reversions. So every year, appropriations are made to departments, and at the end of the year, we have a true up, and from time to time, there's money left over in various departmental appropriations. Most of that we leave with departments. Some of that we revert. to the general fund for other uses. So this year we reverted about $51 million. So when you add that to some additional transfers and sports wagering and the e-board upgrade, we had about little under $140 million to deploy. And that's what appears in the budget adjustment document. Against that, though, I will point out some what we're calling known obligations that kind of take that number and cut it down quite a bit. The chair will remember during the July e-board meeting, we initiated called the BGAP program, Business Emergency Gap Assistance Program. To do that, we transferred $20 million that was set aside for broadband implementation. And we actually, the Commissioner of Finance was asked in the e-board motion to come with a plan to replace that money. So our plan is to replace it in the budget adjustment. So that's $20 million. We're setting aside $30 million. I'd refer to it as a down payment on our ultimate FEMA state match requirement. We think it will be larger than $30 million, being that we currently have approximately $600 million of known public assistance money that will be eligible for FEMA reimbursement. So we're thinking in and around $60 million of state match will be required. So we're making a down payment on that with $30 million. We're also putting another $6 million for municipal state match assistance that we will send to the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund. So, you take $30 million from FEMA match, another $6 million for state assistance, $20 million for broadband. Also, the Attorney General's settlement for the Sutton EB5 court case. That's $9.5 million in fiscal 24. There'll be another, I forget how much, not that much, but I think the total amount was $16 million that will come out in the subsequent 2 years. So we're putting aside $9.5 million today in the budget adjustment. So in total, there's like $65 million that almost immediately comes right off the top of that, $140 million or so. And then the remainder we invest. I don't think it'll be any surprise to anyone here that the majority of that goes to human services for caseload and utilization pressures that were unanticipated or higher than anticipated. There's also money set aside, about $12 million in total for housing. $8.2 million to get the general assistance program through the end of fiscal 24, through the end of June. Another $4 million to build out shelters in a couple of communities statewide. So that's also in budget adjustment. So I guess when you kind of get through that, that really kind of takes up the majority of the document that we presented to House Appropriations last week. But there were a number of items that I think will end up in your under your purview.
Before you jump into the specific items, which I think are mostly language with a few numbers. When you think about reversions, how do you make the decisions about work being completed or not? So how do we differentiate between we set something in statute, we appropriated the money for it, and somehow we weren't able to make it happen, but still can, versus there's sort of a decision made that it's not going to happen, which in some ways can sort of, I think the reversion process could be used sometimes as a way for the administration to sort of reset goals that might have been already set in statute. And so I'm curious sort of how you make decisions about what gets reverted and what stays.
So we are not allowed to reset goals. The law is the law. And I want you guys to know when an appropriation is made, regardless of whether the governor signed the budget or it was overridden, that's the law. So we carry out everything in the budget. What's left over at the end are really two things. The first is appropriations that are made that we haven't yet been able to carry out. And that would be illustrated by roughly $450 million-ish of one-time money. It was left over because those are programs that haven't been fully executed. Those are contracts that haven't fully gone out. There's a various, and some of that actually is already obligated, but we just haven't sent the check out yet. So that's the first thing, and that's almost always the most numerous. But the second thing are leftover appropriations, base spending in departments. It 9 times out of 10 comes because the departments have vacancies that come from payroll. So we had about $104 million of leftover appropriations that were presented to us at the end of the year. At the end of the fiscal year in July, the departments go through each of their appropriations, and as do we in financial operations. And we ask them to submit us what we call a carry forward memo, meaning we generally send them a list of what they have in their appropriations left over, but we make sure that it comports with what they have. And then we ask them to tell us what they want to do with this.
I think where I'm coming from is, and we don't really have to go any deeper on this, is I think sometimes those vacancies themselves are costing us money, even though we're sort of saving money in budget adjustment or in budget. Sometimes fully staffing these positions would say, for instance, might save the education fund a huge amount of money if we were able to better staff the Agency of Education to serve districts, just as an example. But I think that's true across state government. And I know it's really hard for us to plan long-term on the 2-year cycle that we're in this building, but really thinking more deeply about that issue and the issue of vacancies. Because I think on an individual level, it can seem just sort of exciting to save the money, but I think the pressure on individual departments to do their jobs well with those vacancies in place is crushing.
We've often been asked whether we ask departments to hold vacancies. And I can confirm for you in no uncertain terms, we do not ask departments to hold vacancies. In our budgeting, however, we assume vacancies. For example, it would be foolish in the state police not to assume that they're going to have, I've been here 7 years, and the vacancy rate in state police has been somewhere between 10 to 30 state troopers every single year. As you imagine, it went up during the pandemic. They're struggling to hire. We're doing our best to help them out. They have a side letter with their contracts and the like, but to assume that they're not going to have vacancies would just be silly. So we budget for that, but we ask departments to budget realistically. By that I mean, if you assume that you're going to fill whatever vacancies you have, we ask you to budget for that. And we don't tell departments to keep vacancies because that, to your point, I think that would end up costing us more than we would save.
This is, sort of less than purview. Sorry, diving into it, but
no, I think it's a good question.
I understand there's sort of a difference between, I think that we could do more about filling those vacancies in a strategic way than maybe we are right now. And I think it would be helpful to spend more time thinking about that because I know the vacancy rate has gone up considerably over the last few years. And I know that's true across, and we've certainly talked about housing and workforce and all of that. But as employers, I think we sort of look at the statewide solution, but I think some more time about thinking about it as employers would be helpful.
I can just speak to my department too, because I've been really.
Best place to work in state government?
That's what we're going for. And we've put a lot of focus on this. So over the last year or so, we've carried like a 5 or 6% vacancy rate, which I think is pretty strong when you look around state government. And I mean, what you're talking about is exactly where our head is at, right? We're competing with other state agencies. We're competing with the private sector, with nonprofits, with the federal government. With the legislature, what can we do to set ourselves apart, right? How can we build a strong culture and make sure that we've got those staff? But as Adam said, right, even with those really aggressive and strategic choices, we carry that 5 or 6% vacancy rate. And so we have that baked into our operational budget as vacancy savings instead of assuming every dollar of payroll will go out in any given year. I mean, I also think about other programs like the renter credit, right? That's a great example of how you can end up with extra money where the legislature appropriated that, administration agreed. We all want to be spending that amount of money for a variety of reasons we aren't. And that creates one-time money at the end of the year. And then sometimes, like this year, we come back and say, let's expand this program so that we try to hit that goal.
Thank you. Representative Andrews, and do you still have something?
I do.
Okay, and then Odie, and then Anthony, and then we're gonna get into the specifics.
Commissioner, I think I heard you say that there was like around $450 million of like one-time money that did not get spent. Is that correct?
That's about right, yeah.
Yeah. So then where does that revert back to the feds? Like where does that money go?
So in the carry forward memos that departments submit, they tell us why that money's there. Virtually always that money for one-time appropriations are very directed, and they're there because they haven't fully executed the program.
Okay.
Or they have a contract out they haven't paid for yet. So it's rare that we take one-time money because it's usually very direct. So that they carry it forward. It just stays in that appropriation.
I think I heard one-time money and assumed it was, so thank you for that clarification.
ARPA carries forward, I think, automatically. I think that was legislated to carry forward automatically so that we don't have.
But isn't there like some point in time at which we have to give that money back if we don't spend it?
Yes, it turns into a pumpkin, I think, by 2026,
Yes.
December.
Thank you for that.
Representative Odie?
My concern was about the 450 million, not related to ARPA, but eventually, will that money make it to where it's been appropriated?
Unquestionably. And if it doesn't, in other words, if we appropriate $1 million for a program and it turns out we only need 990,000, the department will write us and say, look, we're done. We've done everything we're supposed to do. The world is a better place. Here's another $100,000 we're not using. Then we would revert it and we would bring it back to the general fund. But no, that money will get out there. It's just that some of these programs are pretty big. So it takes a while to get the money out the door.
A great example from our memo, right, is we pay a lot in postage, right? And we do big chunks of money to the U.S. Postal Service at once. And so there can be times around the end of the year where maybe the moment we're going to pay the bill doesn't sync up with exactly how we thought. So we end up with extra money in our budget at the end of the year. And we write to Adam's shop and say, hey, the reason we've got that extra money is because we haven't sent $250,000 to the U.S. Postal Service. So we want to carry that forward. Whereas something like renter credit, again, the appropriation is there, but for multiple reasons, we didn't hit it. So that could be something that gets reverted, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you both.
Sure.
Representative Anthony?
Pass.
And then we're getting into specifics.
This is about a specific line item. Is that not appropriate?
Sure, go for it.
I'd just like to hear a little bit more about the 9.5 down payment on the liability around EB5. Certainly discouraging to hear that after my communities didn't get what they deserved, we're also taxpayers are on the hook for a significant amount of money. I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more about whether we've learned anything from our experience with AIG about what coverage we need moving forward. So if we make missteps, our insurance company is there for us, not our taxpayers.
I think that would be a better question for risk management. I think it's a reasonable question. This would be a tough event to anticipate. I will tell you that. But I think it's a reasonable question for risk management. I don't mean to defer. I just don't have anything intelligent that I can.
And sort of towards that end, I think there are a few areas in state government that have sort of become very public lately, like EB5 or Woodside, that I think we need to find a better public process for being very clear that we've learned lessons and have shifted strategies so such things didn't happen again, or that we're minimizing our risk of such things happening again. And just sort of welcome an ongoing conversation about how we can do that better as state government. And with that, let's get into the details.
So on this, I think it's 6-page sheet, I just went by section. And, I think the first thing that will probably come to your shop, or at least you should be aware of, is that in section B 509 of the big bill, section 29 here, the budget adjustment, we're changing funding sources from the education fund to special fund. And special fund is the after-school learning, after school and summer learning special fund. And you will see throughout the budget adjustment line items that get to what we're trying to do, which is to set up a special fund and direct all cannabis sales tax into the special fund directly, as opposed to putting it in the general fund and then transferring it from the general fund, or pardon me, the education fund, and transferring from the education fund to the special fund.
And from my
So
perspective.
this is the first notation.
This is useful because the way the education fund is set up, we can't fund, sort of grant directly to all of the organizations that provide after-school money. It's not how it's set up. It's very explicitly designed not to behave that way. And we've made a promise about how these particular tranche of sales tax will be used. And so we need to make sure that it's going where we promised it to go to. So I think the special fund is a great.
So that's the first line item. You'll remember last year, the budget was $4 million appropriation from the education, but we're just changing the fund source, being that in the next few sections, the next section will deal with property transfer tax, but you'll see later in this document, we're actually setting up the special fund, the after-school learning special fund. But if we're going in order of sections, section 46 is what I would call a purely technical document. I like to maybe call in jest of it was the Tom Stevens appropriation, Representative Stevens, in that when the legislation was written, there was a double appropriation of the property transfer tax to VHCB, to the municipal and regional planning commissions. It was inadvertent, but they actually appropriate in the B section and then they appropriate again in the D section. So we're changing it here just to make one appropriation. So we're changing the D section language. We're taking out the word is appropriated, which is very meaningful word in our world. And we're just saying is allocated, which is not so much a meaningful word, but it doesn't mean we're actually sending more money, because in the B section, we do send money. We do the appropriation. So this is a technical fix that we do in that section. In section 48, so this is a transfer from the education fund to the special fund that accounts for the amount of sales tax revenue that came into the education fund in fiscal 23. And because the fiscal year end has already occurred, that fund is closed. We can't actually go back in and open it up and transfer money. So what we're doing is we're tallying what cannabis sales tax revenue came into that fund in 23, and in 24, we're making a transfer from the ed fund to the special fund in that amount. So that's why you see that transfer in there. Also in section 48, which deals with transfers, I don't know whether this committee is the committee of jurisdiction for sports wagering.
We do spend some time on it. GovOps is the governance side of it, and we spent some time on the fees and the revenue sharing.
When
We spent a lot of time with Bill.
Okay, well, I didn't know, so I figured I would put it in there. We, as you can see, the original estimate for sports wagering for this fiscal year, being that it starts this week, right? Mm-hmm. So from this week through the end of the fiscal year, we'll all be busy at the end of the week. We assumed that it would take in $3.2 million net. The original estimate that came either from the administration or joint fiscal office, I don't know which one made that estimate, but originally it was thought of 1.2 million. Turns out that Liquor and Lottery has contracted with 3 different sports wagering vendors. based on, and they're, names that you would know that deal in the industry. Based on their history, they could give us a reasonably good idea of what we could anticipate in terms of revenue. So this number reflects what we think is a half a year of revenue. So.
Is that,
They paid fees, those three organizations paid fees to be able to operate in Vermont.
is that in here too?
That,
Significant fees.
Yes.
Yeah.
oh, you mean, right? Would you know that?
I don't know the answer to that offhand.
That's a good question, though. I'll get back to you on that, Bill.
Thank you.
In the following section, there's a change to the tax computer system modernization fund transfer.
Yeah, to make,
One more sports wagering
Yeah.
question. Do you anticipate that this new projection would be included in the e-board?
So I think so. I think so. I mean, I think this is going to be a regular revenue item.
Yeah,
So yes.
okay. Because there's sort of some discomfort from going from JFO projections to projections from the corporations that were contracting with projections without like,
Yeah.
a final arbiter of the.
Although I would think that their initial projections probably will rely upon the same
Yeah.
data since we don't have any history to it. But yeah, I think it should be part of the regular forecast, just like liquor is.
yeah, time to earn my keep. Remember, this was a 50-50 split. So the tax computer modernization fund language, I think folks will probably remember this was a fund. Well, it is a fund that we've had for the last decade or so at the tax department. It's done really great work, helped us fund the awesome VTech system and other systems. And it was modified time after time in session law. And so last year we said, why don't we just codify this thing, make it sustainable moving forward, and then make it part of the annual budgeting process. So this is some cleanup language to clarify that funding that is in there at the end of the year remains there, which is the same process that it has undergone for the last 10 years plus at this point.
Great.
The next section 52 actually establishes the after-school and summer learning program special fund. So you see the language here. What we did was we amended last year's big bill to establish the fund. And it largely follows last year's language. There are some changes which you see outlined to make it clear that we are establishing the fund.
And y'all, this is important because it's sort of a mechanism to protect the integrity of the education.
And you'll actually, to the chair's point, there's actually language further down that you'll see where there's statutory amendments, both to Title 16 and Title 32 for that reason.
Excuse me. Why did that come out of the ed fund? The money that we're putting into this new fund?
So originally, the money went directly into the ed fund, and then it came out of the ed fund and was granted directly to the various childcare or after-school providers. So we're changing that mechanism, but we're not, it's cost neutral because that money was set aside. It was cannabis sales tax revenue. It was set aside for after-school programs. It's just that the way we got it to the after-school programs was to put it first in the ed fund where all sales tax goes, and then from the ed fund grant it to childcare providers. And that, to the chair's point earlier, limited the childcare providers the flexibility to provide to childcare providers that were not part of LEAs, the local education associations. So it was kind of clunky. Well, it was statutory. I mean, we couldn't do it. So this will give the agency of education and the committee that she will work with much more flexibility to choose childcare providers. So.
And when we first passed the cannabis, I'm not sure if this has been clear, when we first passed the cannabis bill, it was, the revenue was promised to after-school funding. That was part of the.
So we're not taking any.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just looking for that clarification.
Yes,
So
yes.
when we set up cannabis board, we committed to a portion of that annually going to after school. And we didn't develop the right clear mechanism in order to do it. And so this makes permanent that allocation to a special fund that allows you to re-grant it to all of the right eligible after-school program providers.
I see that would automatically happen.
And so that's what this technical fix is for, is so that it can do that, because the way we set it up makes it very hard to do that. And so we're just sort of fixing the language to align with our original intent.
It's maybe like way too much in the weeds, but this is complementary, but not 21C after-school fund. This is like the state establishing our own ongoing funding for after-school programs.
I think the state already provided some grants towards after-school funding, but this is complementary to those and to 21st Century.
It's in the DCA.
Yes, yeah.
This is going to be substantially more revenue.
Yeah, and
Because not all districts get 21st Century.
right, and is this commingling, or they like accept this special fund is just for this new program
Yeah,
that
there's
is
no-
distinct?
But an individual after-school providing agency could certainly get funding from all three sources plus another 50 that when it's not out. Back to you.
The next, section 61, I put here because I think probably Act 250 fees come through this committee. This was a request from the Natural Resources Board, NRB. They just wanted this technical fix to language just to make clear, as the explanation says, to make clear that the fee cap of $165,000 is per application. It's not a combined. That's the compilation of what I know about this fix. NRB would be very happy to come in and talk to you about it, but I think it's.
That seems very straightforward.
National Resources Board?
Okay, thank you.
Right, we may have a little fix that too. The next one you see is, as I mentioned, a statutory change to Title 16 to make clear that sales and use tax goes into the ed fund except for the sales and use tax for cannabis. That goes to the after-school learning special fund. So this makes that happen in statute.
Yeah, in the next section, this is again related to the tax computer modernization fund. So remember when we did the codification, it went from a revenue diversion to a transfer. So again, very similar discussion as we've had with cannabis. We want to make sure that it's clear that the uses of the ed fund say that transfer from the ed fund to the computer modernization fund is an allowable use. So this is a technical correction to add revenue collection to the list of eligible uses, because we do accounting at the department, but we do a little more than that as well.
Thank you.
Which brings us to the last one, although I did have one more I was going to add, but section 65, which is the, again, this time changing Title 32 statute to make clear that the sales tax revenue goes to the after-school program. I'll note there
What's
that
the extra secret one?
it's not an extra secret one, but it did.
An extra and secret. I didn't mean it was extra secret. I'm sorry that my comma was not.
Well, it did occur to me that this committee, I mean, you guys deal with the ed fund, right?
No.
And there are, as there are for all funds, including the transportation fund, the GEMA fund, there are reversions and, kind of housekeeping appropriations that go on in the ed fund too. This year, there were a number of ed fund changes in the budget adjustment that I note were reflected, I believe, in the most recent education fund outlook.
They were in the outlet we looked at yesterday.
But you will find those in the ed fund, or in the budget adjustment. Most specifically, there's a change, a true up for anticipated costs for unusual special education and extraordinary special education. Both of
I
which
also have a
are
very hard time remembering that.
statutory terms, but based on when the budget was locked in last spring, I mean, the agency makes estimates as to what they think will be the costs, and things change, life happens. So they're asking for additional almost $6 million or $5.5 million total in those two categories. There was also a true up to of the education payment to what actually school budgets, some budgets pass later. So there's about a $7 million true up to what the actual ed payment will need to be. And then there was the a $2.8 million of reversions that will help pay for some of this stuff. So anyway, I just wanted to make sure I pointed that out. If you read through the large spreadsheet that was included, you will see that. Actually, and one final thing in that is there's the just under $2 million correction for an error in the special education payment to districts. The agency, because they're filled with human beings that occasionally make errors, over appropriated by a little under $2 million to districts for special education census block payments. The trouble is letting bygones be bygones would violate his statutory obligation to send out only what he computes is what is needed based on a formula. So it turned out that he had over appropriated or over obligated little, I think $1.9 million. And you can imagine it's, districts have already budgeted for this and they expect it. And so it'd be a little bit unpopular to go back and claw it back. So
Can you help me understand what checks and balances we might have in the future for humans? Like, for instance, in this body, we have 2 chambers to account for humans. And then you also help account.
So that will happen because of this.
What will that look like though?
Well, I don't know. I would ask the agency, but I think it's a reasonable question. I would ask the agency. They would know. That this was not something that we're proud of, but again,
People make mistakes. Yeah.
I make mistakes too.
Yeah.
So there's a workaround. He can't just say, well, sorry, we're going to send out this money. So what we're actually doing is reducing the appropriation by that amount, almost $2 million, and then making a one-time payment from the education fund to special education to make up for it. It's kind of what I would call a very kind of technical wonky fix, but you'll see it in there. I didn't want you to think I was it's anything untoward.
Is this one district or 100 or?
It's a lot of
I
districts.
think closer to 100 than 1.
So it's less of a cliff that people will be, they might not get excited about that one-time big boost, but I guess if you spread out 2 million.
Right. I mean, I don't think this is make or break a budget, but it's, budget says this in this in particular. So I think we just wanted to make it right.
And certainly we can have a secretary in and better understand how this happened. Anything else on budget adjustment for you all? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
So 2 other items that I know we're going to be talking about in budget adjustment in this room are we're going to hear from the treasurer's office now about some COLA things that we did last year that we just sort of need to make amendments. And then tomorrow we're going to try to spend some time talking about some necessary statute for license plates. I actually just leave it over there. Oh. In case, maybe there's a few treasure reps.
Happy to do it.
Thank you, guys.
Treasurer's office is come with the crew.
Just one chair.
Just you, okay. But Ashlyn, I thought Ashlyn over there, okay, great.
I can see somebody else.
Welcome, glad to see you in this new year.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. For your record, Kathleen Boyles, the Deputy Treasurer.
And Ashlyn Doyon, the Director of Policy and Treasurer's Office.
And our regrets from Treasurer Pichak that he couldn't be here personally. I'm prepared to talk about anything that is in our BAA proposal, but I understand maybe we want to just focus on the Beaster's COLA, the teacher's retirement COLA. Perfect.
All the other issues, the appropriations, and they can hash out amongst themselves without us.
Great.
Thank you.
So I won't,
Statute language,
I'm sorry?
you have a few different items.
Yes.
So guide us through them.
Yes, so we submitted a report to Senator Kitchell and Representative Lanfear on January 3rd. It's included in your materials on this topic, which is essentially truing up the costs and offering statutory language to effectuate what was discussed at some length last year with respect to the teachers' retirement system COLAs. And if you'll recall, the issue was that through what seemed to be some inadvertent changes, the capping methodology for teachers' COLAs resulted in a lower COLA in very high inflation years than appears to have been intended. So funding was appropriated $3 million for a one-time fix for the 2022 high inflation year, when inflation, if you remember, was 7.6% at the time that we measured it for this purpose. Teachers under the statute, as it was written at the time, we gave them a 2.5% COLA, because the way the statute was written at the time, you reduced CPI to 5% and then cut it in half to reach the COLA amount. The prior system would have been simply halving the COLA amount, which would have been 3.8. So the 3 million was a one-time correction, a one-year correction to that. So we're given 3 million to do that. We implemented that this fall. It turns out that it cost about 2.75 million. And we also spent about $75,000 of the 3 million on this study, on this actuarial study. So there is some money left over from the 3 million. Additionally, last year, the legislature asked us to look at the question of what it would cost going forward to revert to the pre-2016 capping methodology, so that in a future high inflation year, the CPI would be half. So in a 7.6% year, the COLA would be 3.8 and not 2.5. So we've now done that. The legislature set aside $9.1 million for that purpose. And the 3 I mentioned already. We had a bit left over from the 3. We've now firmed up the estimate of what that going forward cost actually is with our actuaries based on experience since then. And the actual cost is 9.5. About, I think, 160 or 170,000 is still left over from the 3 million. So what we'd like to do is just take that, and then there is an additional 200-ish thousand needed to get to the 9.5. And then we've just proposed statutory language to implement that intention going forward. And we've worked with NEA throughout to, sort of make sure everyone's on the same page here.
For 1 second, committee, there's a deep background memo of all of this from Chris Roop available on the committee page for you to look at if you want to do some deep background reading. We've talked about this a lot last year, so I'm not going to have him come up and testify about the whole memo. And everything that we're talking about is reflected in the Ed Fund Outlook that we looked at yesterday.
Thank you. And I'll just mention a couple of other, part of our work in sort of having noted this ceiling issue was just to want to go back into the statute and into the history and make sure there were no other inadvertent changes over the years. And we're glad we did that. We seem to have found a couple that involve the floor. So in talking about the ceiling, which is, high inflation years, the floor, which has is meant to protect folks from losing ground in low inflation years. There are a couple of changes there as well. And these are essentially things where we are confident that the legislative intention was simply not carried forward due to inadvertence. And again, we've been working with NEA on these as well. And those are reflected in our statutory language. It's essentially ensuring that in a negative CPI, a negative inflation year, that no one in Group C, which is the active teachers largest group, no one will get a negative COLA. That did happen, I believe, pre-2016. The legislature has clearly stated it doesn't want it to happen again. And that language in some 2022 changes didn't seem to carry through. There's also what's called Legacy Group C, which is a closed group. So no new members in it, and it's relatively small, but pre-2022, they always had a minimum 1% COLA, even in a year when inflation was lower than that. So we're just putting that back in. Again, it seems that it was omitted inadvertently. And then Group A, which is another smaller group, the system had always been that if CPI was less than 1%, they didn't get a COLA. And so putting that back in. And then one other relatively minor change, which again seems to have just dropped by the wayside when the focus was on other things, is that early retirees have always not been eligible for a COLA. If you retire at age 45, not eligible for a COLA until you reach normal retirement age. And that has always been the system, and just reinstating that. None of those things that I've just described, because our actuaries have always operated sort of based on those. None of those are a cost to the system. They're just sort of cleanup items. So that's what we have on teacher COLAs. Happy to field any questions at all.
I don't think we have any. Thank you very much. And committee, what we're going to do is once we sort of have run through all the budget adjustment items in testimony, we'll then sort of have a final conversation about a budget adjustment memo to the operations. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Colin, do you want to say anything? Or you good? Sorry,
I'll say real. No. Well, since everybody's up and moving, I'll just do a real quick run around. I did the same thing downstairs. For the record, Colin Robinson, Vermont NEA. We appreciate the work of the General Assembly on this last year, setting it up for this moment. Appreciate the work of the Treasurer's Office on this, and we're supportive of the language as proposed and the numbers as proposed.
Okay. Any questions for Colin? Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Here, ahead of schedule. We're going to take a break until 2:30.
Wow.
Know where the document is.